My name is Heather Ann Thompson. I'm a professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Michigan. Along with Matt Lassiter, I co-direct the Carceral State Project here at Michigan. And the Carceral State Project is an interdisciplinary collaboration designed to bring impacted communities and advocacy organizations together with researchers from the University of Michigan. Our mission is to document and challenge the historical and contemporary processes of criminalization, policing, incarceration, immigration detention, and other forms of carceral control in the state of Michigan, but also beyond. We are very, very lucky at the CSP to have gotten sponsorship for today's event from the Department of African American Studies, Afro and African American Studies, from the History Department, from the Prison Creative Arts Program, from the School of Literature, Science, and Arts, and especially we want to thank the Trotter Multicultural Center here at Michigan that allowed us to convene in this space. The space itself, named after the civil rights activist William Monroe Trotter, was built to insist on the very principles of human dignity, justice, equality, and anti-racism that bring us together today. And I just encourage you to get one of these upstairs. This is the self-guided tour of the Trotter Center, which is pretty extraordinary. So you can take a look at this lovely space where we are today. I also want to thank as well the advocacy and activist groups who will be here today on the panels who make this convening so important. We are happy, very happy to welcome here to Ann Arbor, Safe and Just Michigan, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, the American Friends Service Committee, all of whom you're going to get to hear from on the panel discussions today. But I'm also really glad to be in the company of so many other great organizations from this area who will also be sharing their important work in a number of different spaces today, lunch tables, workshops, and so forth. The Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, A Brighter Way, Friends of Restorative Justice, the Prison Birth Project, Michigan Citizens for Justice, Michigan Institute for Public Policy, Michigan Liberation, and Students for Decarceration. Finally, I want to give a special thank you to two people, actually three, without whom this day quite literally could not have happened. Our amazing program director of the Carceral State Project, Katie Pieper, in the back, who got us all here today. Also, Stephen Cassidy Jones. Where are you, Stephen? He's our Carceral State postdoc who has been so valuable to the project and, again, to our convening. And, of course, I also want to thank my co-director here, Matt Lassiter, who, if you know anything, you know that the Carceral State Project runs on his energy, for sure. And we are so, so grateful to Matt for today. I'm going to turn it over. We have these amazing panel discussions. You can see in your program what we're doing today, but we also have lunch where we're going to have the opportunity to meet with some of the other advocacy organizations, student organizations, and we're going to have the opportunity today to continue this discussion throughout and end up, and I just want to make a special pitch to hang in there till the very end, because we are going to have an extraordinary opportunity to take a shuttle to the Prison Creative Arts Program art exhibit, the longest running, the most incredible display of art from the inside anywhere on the globe, and it's an incredible treat. So I'm so excited we're going to have our reception up there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks, everybody. So we have a distinguished panel. One of the things we do at the Carceral State Project when we have events on campus is try to have the academics speak very little to none and have people who are out there in the trenches do the speaking. So I'm really excited about the panel today. But I did want to provide just a quick historical overview. We have hundreds of students at the University of Michigan working to document the history of mass incarceration and especially the history of resistance to it, criminalization, immigration detention, and the rest, and a lot of them are in the room today. So the state of Michigan incarcerated around 7,000 people in the early 1970s. Then there was a doubling, and everybody thought it was a crisis. Like, it had gotten extremely bad by the late 1970s. Then it stabilized, and then a bipartisan consensus in Lansing and in Washington to keep locking people up, as you can see in the graph, an exponential increase. This is the national story, and the state of Michigan was a leader in that as well. You have people like Brooks Patterson campaigning against parole. Michigan's was an indeterminate system. You got incarcerated often for a term like a 1 to 10 or 2 to 5, and you could get time off. And Brooks Patterson, misleading, misinformation, and lies about outlier cases, and went after parole. And the legislature wouldn't pass his repeal of good time credit, so he went to the voters and did it in a referendum in 1978. You had the Democrats, the white Democrats in the suburbs of Detroit and the neighborhoods of Detroit, who passed one of the first mandatory minimum laws except for the drug laws, called the Felony Firearms Law. And we went into the archives, and people said at the time, who opposed it, what it would do. It was a terrible law. It was public relations. It was about punishment and vengeance, not justice and rehabilitation. Jackie Vaughn, black representative from Detroit, said, let's pass a gun control law and get rid of handguns altogether. But this is a terrible law targeted at the black community. And Howard Wolf said, this is going to fill our prisons. We won't be able to build them fast enough. In 1978, Michigan passed what became known as the 650 Lifer Law. And Governor Milliken, 20 years later, this law was so bad that John Engler, the right-wing Republican governor, signed the repeal when Families Against Mandatory Minimum and activists really went after it. And Governor Milliken called it the worst mistake of my career. Almost most of the people incarcerated were African American. My research team has dug up many examples in the archives of incarcerated people fighting back as this happened. That always happened throughout. And there's a group of incarcerated people at the Jackson State Prison telling Governor Milliken, we need alternatives to incarceration. What's happening, what we see happening now and what's on the horizon is a terrible mistake. Activist groups fought back. You're going to hear from the Michigan Youth Justice Center later, and they used to be called the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. Here you can see the huge increase in the incarcerated population on the left under Governor Blanchard, a Democrat with a Democratic-controlled legislature, and then under Engler and the Republicans. And more than twice as many people who are incarcerated are controlled by the system through probation and parole. And the MCCD said in 1985, this is not going to have any effect on crime. In fact, incarceration rates kept going up as the crime rate kept going down, but it will have a devastating impact on our state. And Governor Blanchard and the Democrats were gung-ho, most of them at least, for life without parole, expanding the categories that went into life without parole sentencing. Every time you have a punitive escalation, you have media hype and sensationalism, like this mid-1980s stories in the Detroit newspapers that help lead to the waiver law, where prosecutors can put juveniles into the adult system, which we'll have a panel partly about and other people will talk about. This is the super predator discourse, even before that term came about in 1986. And we interviewed the legislative staffers who worked on the 1988 Get Tough crime package that the Democrats supported, including the waiver law. And this is what the legislative staffers said to us in the last couple of years. It's the worst thing we could have done. We knew it at the time. It was aimed at Detroit. It was aimed at the blacks. I thought it was going to be bad. I had no idea we were going to end up with a prison full of kids. Prosecutors who have no moral compass can do incredible damage. It was macho posturing for fraudulent demagogic reasons in elections. And that we knew that the one thing that could actually solve the problem was more jobs and more welfare programs, and we were doing the exact opposite. The corrections budget in this state went from 2% of the general funds to 20%, and this is just the corrections system, not policing and all the other parts of the criminal legal system, with all the consequences that we know about from that. Throughout this time, more than half of people incarcerated in the juvenile facilities and in the adult correctional system were African American, about 4 times the population rate, and that's been a pretty constant. At least through the early 2000s. You're going to hear later about Governor Engler and his campaign for so-called truth in sentencing and getting rid of parole for huge numbers of people. isolated incidents, and then policies are passed that affect tens of thousands of people. And we're also going to be hearing from groups and CAPS, what is now Safe and Just Michigan. John and Ronnie Waters are from that group, and CAPS emerged. My Cure emerged earlier. The American Friends Service Committee was fighting, people on the outside and people on the inside fighting together. And the prison system has declined somewhat in the last couple decades. It's still bad. It's not quite as bad as it used to be, and this is because of the labor and the work of the people that we have in the room. There's been lots of lawsuits, and Deborah LaBelle's about to tell you about that. So things could be worse, but it's still a very punitive system, racially disproportionate, and the rest. Now I'm going to turn it over to the panel, and we have 3 distinguished panelists here today. I'm not going to read their long introductions, but the bios are in the program if you want to take a look as they're talking or later. And what I asked the panelists is, let me just say, John Cooper from Safe and Just Michigan co-organized this panel with us, and all of these panels are co-organized with the partner organization. So John and I came up with a couple of prompts, and I'm going to read the first one, and then the panelists can really say whatever they would like to say in their response. And I asked them to introduce themselves to the extent that they want to as they're giving the remarks. And so the first prompt is, please start by introducing yourself, explaining your work and experiences involving the Michigan criminal legal system, and then please think about this question. Between the 70s and the 90s, the state of Michigan significantly escalated its punitive policies, as I've just given an overview, from policing and racial criminalization, harsh sentencing laws and prosecutions, to prison and the parole systems and beyond. And what do you consider, personally, more generally, the most important historical forces and causes of this punitive escalation? What laws and policies would you most like to highlight? And what forms of resistance and advocacy did you or your organization, or just more generally, would you point to push back against these policies? And we're going to start with John Cooper. John is here in the middle of the 3 panelists, and he's the executive director of Safe and Just Michigan. Over to you, John, and make sure to...
Thanks very much, Matt, and it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday morning. So just very, very briefly, my background, I'm a lawyer by training, criminal defense lawyer. I also studied history at the University of Virginia, which is where Matt went. We had a few professors in common. And I've always thought that you can't do good policy work unless you understand the history that the policy you're trying to change arose from. And I think that's not true with any subject more than mass incarceration, the criminal justice system. For me, the cause of the punitive turn in Michigan criminal justice policy really starts with the Great Migration out of the South by African Americans in the Jim Crow era. And I think really it's a story about Metro Detroit more than anything else. Just to give you some context, in the 1910 census, the population of Detroit was about 500,000. There's about 6,000 black people in Detroit, so a little more than 1%. By 1950, there's more than 300,000 black people in Detroit. In a city of 1.8 million, that's more like 20%. And 1910 to 1950 was an extraordinarily racist time in our history. 1910 was around the time that Woodrow Wilson was screening Birth of a Nation in the White House and resegregating the civil service. So when very large numbers of black, essentially refugees from the South, were coming up to Detroit to work in the auto industry and the defense industry, they were not met with open arms. They were met with housing discrimination, redlining, police brutality, and ultimately a great deal of suspicion. And so Rosa Parks actually moved to Detroit in the 50s, and she said, I don't feel a great deal of difference here from Alabama. Housing segregation is just as bad, and it seems more noticeable in the larger cities. And so What you see in Detroit in the 50s is increasing migration, increasing growth of the black population, and white flight out to the suburbs because white residents of Detroit are wanting to live in white cities with white school districts. And that is something that works for a while for them. But once you get the civil rights movement, you also get things like the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which bans most of the legal tools that were being used to keep the suburbs white. You get the busing movement, which was the sort of next logical step of Brown versus Board of Education. And in 1970, the Detroit suburbs were 97% white. And political support for civil rights was beginning to deteriorate when the civil rights movement came after the suburbs. And this was already starting to happen in the late 60s. Many of you probably know about the 67 rebellion, which was the largest urban conflict since the Civil War in the United States. 43 people died over 5 days. Not just the National Guard, but the U.S. Army was called in to quell things. And it was covered really sensationally nationally. The Detroit Free Press got a Pulitzer for it, but the coverage was largely blaming the black residents of Detroit for what was a rebellion against police brutality and other discriminatory practices that were making their lives miserable. So, in the context of the late 60s, the rebellion, we have the 1968 election, and Richard Nixon runs on a law and order platform. This is running against the riots. It's running against the U.S. Supreme Court, which had liberalized criminal procedure over that time. And it's really running against the Great Society and civil rights. The idea was if Nixon could get the South to vote Republican, then he would have a winning coalition nationally. And as many of you know, he did win, and that cemented a tough-on-crime coalition nationally. So you get in 1970 the first federal Controlled Substances Act, and then in Michigan, I think the real flashpoint here was Oakland County. And Matt alluded to Brooks-Patterson. So this started in Oakland County, which was overwhelmingly white. It was, essentially a segregated suburb. Brooks-Patterson was a young lawyer in private practice who represented it was called the National Advocacy something, but it was the public face of the anti-busing movement. And he was hired to be their lawyer. He was the lead counsel in litigation opposing busing in Oakland County. And he used the notoriety he got as the lead counsel for that organization to run for Oakland County prosecutor in 1972. He won, and from there he really became the face of the tough-on-crime movement in Michigan. He was Oakland County prosecutor until the late 80s. He was then Oakland County executive until 2020 when he died. So he was this figure for 50 years in Oakland County who essentially wanted to keep black people out of Oakland County. And I'll just give you a quote he gave to the New Yorker in 2014. He said, "I made a prediction long time ago, and it's come to pass. I said, what we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw the blankets and corn in." He opposed regional transit for this whole time. He was not shy about what his goals were. And he approached the criminal justice system as a tool for keeping black people out of Oakland County. He was extraordinarily punitive. We can talk more about that later. Matt already mentioned the Proposal B in 78, but it was really sort of like, Governor Milliken opposed Proposal B, but Brooks-Patterson won. He went on a statewide, bus tour, speeches. His assistants were door knocking in Oakland County, lying about what the law would do and why it should be passed. And it was an extraordinarily aggressive, dishonest, but effective campaign. So where does this leave us? I know I'm talking a little bit over, but if we think of the buildup of mass incarceration in Michigan, I look at sort of 3 eras. And the first one is what Matt mentioned, 73 to 78. The population doubles basically in that time from about 7,700 to 15,000. Then in the 80s, under Blanchard primarily, we see a massive buildup from 85 to 92. There's 23 new prisons open during that time. There's a 18,000 increase during that time. The population doubles again from about 18,000 to about 35. And then the third wave is in the 90s under Engler. You have 10 more prisons being opened, 40% plus increase, again, from 35,000 to almost 50,000 people in prison. And by 2003, the projection is that there will be 58,000 people in prison in Michigan. And that, at the time, was even seen as underestimating because the full effect of the 98 Truth in Sentencing law hadn't really been factored in. So I'll save the rest for the second part, but that is kind of when things start to turn, is around 2003.
Thank you, John. So next we're going to hear from Deborah LaBelle, and as with everybody on the panel, the biography in the program doesn't do justice. Deborah is a fierce legal advocate and has filed lots of lawsuits and won some important ones. Done a lot with, helped start the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth and a lot more. So I'll let Deborah tell you more about herself. Don't be modest, Deborah, and tell us about the history and how you see it.
Thanks, Matt. And I want to thank Matt and Heather and the people working to put this together. I hope it's not the last event at the Trotter Multicultural Center, since multicultural is on one of the banned words from the Trump anti-DEA. But if it is, I'm proud to be here today. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the litigation that I've been involved with, because I think it tracks some of what has happened in Michigan, and it also provides a lens as to why I think the pivot from that type of litigation is so important right now. I started, I came to the law school here initially from the doctoral program in philosophy. So I had been reading a little bit too much Foucault, I think, in my time. But I did get focused on the conditions of punishment and when I became a lawyer, and determined to shine light, understanding Foucault, that disciplinary power is exercised through its invisibility, and the objectification and dehumanization of those who are being punished, and started to understand that, torture and abuse, as we always know, flourishes in the darkness and the hidden places, which defines our prisons. And so I became involved early on in a class, the first class in the country of women prisoners who got together. And we have the namesake, Mary Glover, sitting right here, of that case. And I realized, in looking at what was happening, that the inequities in the prison system, of course, are a reflection of the worst social inequities that we have out here. So, the issues with class, with race, with gender, they're just writ large in the prison. That's who gets punished, and that's how they get punished, based on those criterias that are problematic on the outside. And at the time, women were being punished harsher than men. And the case was about, ideally, it was to get comparative or equal opportunity for rehabilitation for women as to men. Because at the time, the law and the judges were punishing women because they believed it was a failure of femininity. And that was language used in a lot of judgments, that you stepped over the line. You're supposed to be the mothers. You're supposed to be the peacemakers. And when you breach the law, when you're violent, when you do these transgressions, you are an embarrassment to your gender. You are we must punish, and dangerous, because we're going to punish you even harsher because you are not following the role model. And women were getting harsher sentences. And literally what the MDOC was giving as rehabilitation programming was home ec and parenting classes. Because if we can reinstill the feminine ideal in you, then you'll go forth and not, violate anymore. So the case started out that way, to say, we want what they have, until we realized that what the men had isn't so great either. But the idea was to provide rehabilitative program education, and in many ways the case was wildly successful in some ways, in that education programs were brought in, rehabilitation training was started, and in the context of all this, you start to see, of course, deeply what women are telling you about many things, that there's no access to the courts. So it morphs off into an access to justice case, that we don't have visitation, and that is going to be crucial to our success. So then we filed a visitation case. And then all of these things that were viewed as necessary for reintegration. We don't have mental health treatment. We don't have this and that. So the case got, really large. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court a couple times in various areas. And yet, I do think in some ways it was the beginning of women organizing themselves inside in a very progressive way and speaking out, and taking some agency over what was going on. And it brought in programs such as from the University of Michigan, programs in literature and gender studies. And so there was the cracking of the light open a bit, which I think was successful as well as the others. But then what you saw was the damage that was happening inside. And what I saw was the damage, the sexual abuse damage that was going on deeply inside, the trading for visits, the dehumanization of the touching and viewing of women's bodies, the rapes that were occurring between the custodial staff and women. And so we filed a case on that. And the reason I talk about these cases is because that began the idea that you're not going to make any change unless you force people to address the inherent dignity and humanity of people inside, unless you change that concept. You can do all you want with, treatment inside, but unless you change the public perception and the internal perception of people and families and everybody and victims' family and everybody affected, we can't move forward on the progress. And one of the positions we took there in terms of doing that case on sexual abuse was, one, to let women lead that very deep charge. And it was difficult. The retaliation was intense. It was to bring in Human Rights Watch, who did a deep report on it, and began, actually, the Women's Division of Human Rights Watch began with this case. Also, we had Amnesty International in, and all detailing the kinds and documenting the kinds of abuse that were going on. And meanwhile, keeping a class together under that abuse, the women inside, was amazing. The strength that was evidenced there. And one of the things we realized in going through all of that, and we brought in people from the gender studies here to do classes on body betrayal, to talk about what was going on with, how you survive these kinds of abuse. So again, you're starting to bring the outside in, and you're starting to give women a platform on the inside to talk about what's going on out there. They did press. They did international press at deep, deep consequences to themselves. And then when we went to trial, we said, how do you recognize damage in this country and this legal system? And we do it by money. That's how we do it. We can't change what happens. We were intent on removing, and it was the first prison in which men were removed from oversight of women in the prison, the first in the country. That was as a result of that litigation, and we followed the Mandela rules and a lot of other countries that forbid that kind of interaction and that privacy violation. But I was determined that, you're going to validate the damage and the humanity. And so it was the first case in which money became a big issue. And money, it turned out to be the largest settlement ever, not just for prisoners, but in Michigan, the largest settlement of $100 million. And no, they had not, they would not pay it. They said, oh, juries will never give that. But they gave it, and they gave it with a statement at the end that, it was pretty incredible, because they said they wanted to apologize to the women. They did. On behalf of the state of Michigan for the human rights abuses you suffered at our hands. So the ownership, the shame, and the recognition of the humanity became to me very important as we move forward. And that is sort of brought me to the youth case, because you saw all the children in there who were also caught up in the abuse. And in fact, they were primary targets of predators. So we then went to deal with youth in adult prisons and the sexual abuse. We were able to get rid of solitary confinement for youth in the adult prisons. And although there's still 2 youth in there, pretty much we shut down the spigot that brought youth into the adult prisons. And they're separated and they're in now. And again, with a combination of money, and it was a much smaller group, but it was 80 million that time, to talk about the damage that you're doing, and then there was injunctive relief. And I just want to talk that at that moment, for me, I started to pivot and see that doing conditions cases and even addressing the damages wasn't enough. It just wasn't. And so that it led me to the front end in sentencing, that we have to stop what essentially is a feeder program. And I want to talk a little bit about that more later, but in order, just like I try to tell legislators now, if you want to be tough on crime, be preventative. Stand up, quit clutching your pearls and avoiding the issues. Be preventive on crime. That's the toughest way. So if we're going to stop the damage, I thought we had to work, or the group that I worked with had to work on preventative, and to stop going in and focused on the feeder program, what was happening to demonize our children. And 40% of the current, 41% of the current population right now, yesterday when we ran the numbers, are youth in the Michigan Department of Corrections. You want to cut the population in half? Stop the feeder program of youth going in. Alter the way we and the legislatures have demonized for so long the youth, and focus on it. And, I can talk a little bit. Am I running out of time? Yeah.
Well, you get another question, so it's up to you.
So I'll talk later about how I think we've made movements there and what I think is crucial if we're really going to do this. And move forward with de-incarceration in a real way, and change the way we look at the way people who, breach the laws are treated in this state.
Thank you, Deb. So next up, we're going to hear from Ronnie Waters, who's the Community Engagement Specialist at Safe and Just Michigan, and that only begins to introduce Ronnie, but I'll let Ronnie introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ronnie Waters. I'm with Safe and Just Michigan, and as the 2 lawyers are talking and bringing up particularly L. Brooks Patterson, I could talk about more of me, but let's talk about something else. Yeah, L. Brooks Patterson, and I was just thinking about how intertwined he was into my life, and probably the most, he had the most impact on my life as any individual other than my parents or relative. When I was in the 3rd grade, I'm from Pontiac, Michigan, and when I was in the 3rd grade, they said, we're gonna start busing. This was back in 1971, I know I look a little younger, but I'm old man. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. 1971, it's gonna start busing in Pontiac, Michigan. And as a 3rd grader, I was excited. Hey, I'm gonna take a bus ride every day. We didn't even have a car, so I'm gonna get a bus and they're gonna take us to another neighborhood. This was exciting. And the news flashed somewhere before we went to school that the Ku Klux Klan had bombed all the buses in Pontiac. They literally blew the buses up. And that delayed school for us. And that was cool, you know, like, okay, we didn't understand much of what was going on, but it was cool, you know. And there were all kind of protests. And I remember this woman named Irene McKay. She was very vocal and very, we're going to stop this, and we're not going to let them go to school with our kids, and that type stuff. And the lawyer who represented Irene was L. Brooks Patterson. This is how he got his career started, and it was such a racist time, you know. But L. Brooks was very vocal and just told you what he thought, and it's obvious that a lot of people gravitated towards him, and he was able to do things in his state to the criminal justice system that no one else was able to do, you know. And after representing Irene, he became prosecutor of Oakland County, so the stepping stones. And he always, each stepping stone that L. Brooks took, he always played the race card, always. And unfortunately, he used me as a pawn. In 1980, I was 17 years old, and I committed a crime, a very senseless crime. I took the life of another human being. I never planned for things to go the way they went, but I don't take away that it was my responsibility for everything that happened. However, I was going through the process, and there was an assistant attorney prosecutor who was prosecuting me, and everyone was saying, well, this is, whatever it is, it's a second degree, it's not a life or a first degree offense. Everyone said that. And the judge took me through the preliminary stages of proceedings, and he bonded me over on second degree murder and gave me a $1,000 bond. When he did that, the courtroom erupted. You know, the white people in the courtroom erupted. Like, this is not fair, you know? And I'm like, I didn't really understand it. I'm like, what's not fair about it? They finna put that hammer down on my head. What's not fair about it? But they didn't want to just put that hammer down. They wanted blood out of me. So immediately after proceedings, the family marched to L. Brooks Patterson's office and said, hey, you got to get some of this. And immediately, L. Brooks springed into action. When I got back to the county jail, I thought I was going to get bailed out. I was going home. So even we could afford to pay that $1,000 bond. But they said, hey, you going back to court. I'm saying, no, this is a mistake. My family's coming to get me. I'm going home. So you're going back to court. And Oakland County Jail, there's a system where you go underground and you walk through tunnels and you never see the light of day, and you come up out of the county jail into the courthouse. And when we walked through this tunnel, I'm like, uh-oh, they're about to get me. You know, I thought that was the end of me. I'd never been through that process before. I ended up walking through the tunnel. They didn't get me. Walking through the tunnel and entering the courtroom. And I was just sitting there. There were men up front. I've heard the name L. Brooks Patterson over and over and over. Never met him, didn't really know how he looked. And finally, my lawyer came in, and the judge said, you know, they introduced themselves. He said, L. Brooks Patterson, prosecuting attorney. I'm like, wow, I'm in awe. You know, I'm a kid. I'm in awe. Oh, that's L. Brooks Patterson. The judge said, no bond, and we raised the charge to open murder. And that was it. And I went back. My lawyer said, I'm coming to talk to you. He came to talk to me, and he said, man, we got a fight on our hand. From that day forward, L. Brooks Patterson, he made plenty of statements in the press that he would personally handle this prosecutor. We're going to let this little punk get away with doing what he was doing. And at that time, in 1980, some of you may be historians and remember that L. Brooks was trying to get the death penalty in Michigan, and he was the lead person in that effort. And he used my case. As you said, he exaggerated things. And the guy was so skilled that I'm sitting in the courtroom with him, and as he was exaggerating things and stuff, he was so good that he was convincing me that maybe I did mean to do this. Maybe things happened in a way that he said when I know that they did not. Well, just to make a long story short, I wasn't a match for L. Brooks Patterson, and he ended up getting a conviction for me for first-degree murder, and that conviction held for 40 years, off a silly mistake that I made. He held me, and he branded me as public enemy number one, and used my case to start his campaign for the governorship and trying to get the death penalty in Michigan. So I know firsthand how punitive, how devastating the effects of L. Brooks Patterson has had on the state of Michigan and the criminal justice system in particular. He had said that, I'm gonna close too, because I'm talking to, but he had said that Ronnie Waters would get out over my dead body. And in 2020, I got out practically over his dead body. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie, for sharing that. And I assume most people in the room know, but until quite recently, Michigan was one of the only states that automatically charged all 17-year-olds as adults, 17-year-old kids for a misdemeanor, for a felony, and the waiver for prosecutors was for 16 and under because 17-year-olds automatically classified that way. So let me also mention that to the extent that we have time for Q&A, which I think we may not have much, because there's so many people in the room and we're expecting it to be more crowded in the afternoon panels, we do have a QR code up here, and it's in your program on the first page. And if you want to scan that with your phone or go to the website and type a question in, Heather's monitoring that. And if we don't get to them, it'll also be very helpful to hear what your questions are. You can give us feedback too if you want. Okay, so I'm going to give one more prompt to the panel, and I really appreciate how clearly they laid out how the criminal legal system and mass incarceration in Michigan is rooted in resistance to the civil rights movement and anti-black racism and the paucity or the turn against a generous social welfare state and the geography, the racial geography of metropolitan Detroit. Ronnie's from Pontiac, which was one of the only places in Oakland County where black people lived at all back in the 70s and 80s, and eventually also a little bit in Southfield. So the next question is, by the mid to late 90s, Michigan was incarcerating more than 50,000 people, triple the total in the early 1980s. African Americans so disproportionately targeted, as we've discussed. There was clearly a bipartisan political consensus. Both parties were part of the race to get punitive and to get tough. And all of you have worked in different ways against that consensus and seen maybe it's changed, maybe that's a debate. But in the last quarter century, reformers and advocacy groups and directly impacted people have worked to reduce the prison population and change the criminal legal system more broadly. What are some of the most important recent or current campaigns to change this punitive system, including perhaps those that you or your organization has worked on directly? What are some of the continuing obstacles and challenges to bring about a more safe and just Michigan? But also in these difficult times, I think it's important to hear about the victories, even the partial victories, and what works, not just what doesn't work. So, John, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Matt. And yeah, thank you, Ronnie, for sharing that. I didn't know all that. That's amazing. So I think, if 2003 was kind of the high water point for the tough on crime era, The last roughly sort of 15 to 20 years have kind of been the reform era, and I think Matt already highlighted the drug law mandatory minimum repeals in 1998 and 2002. Those were really important, and I think they were important because they were some of the leading proponents of those policies admitting that they were not working and that we needed to try something else. Engler was a very tough on crime guy. He was behind the truth in sentencing law, among other things. But ultimately, like 58,000 people in prison just was unsustainable. It was too expensive. It was obviously not just. You're just really warehousing people who aren't dangerous, and that's bad for society. So that cleared the way for the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative, which happened under Granholm. That was sort of a 2005 through 10 project. It wasn't just about reentry. It had historic parole rates. There was 13,000 some people paroled, I think, in 2010, over 10,000 the year before. And those were among the leading causes of the reduction in prison population that we're seeing today, was just starting to parole people, especially people who were very far past their eligibility. There was some good clemency work that happened during that time too, but that was really like proactive decarceration and attempting to set people up for success when they're released. And I think that's a really important philosophy. Later, we worked on, the first campaign I worked on was called presumptive parole. That ended up passing in 2018, and that's the idea that people should be getting paroled on their minimum eligibility unless there's something really wrong in their risk profile. And that has been helpful at continuing what the Prisoner Reentry Initiative started. There was a great jails task force that was funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts in 19 and 20 that passed 19 bills that really got at the root causes of admission to jail and prison. That's been really important. And that and then the Clean Slate Law were both, I think, really important for identifying the economic causes of crime. The idea that, if you look at white flight and the legacy of housing discrimination, what you did was you created a population of people with a deep poverty and deep lack of opportunity, and those are drivers of crime. And then when you police that population aggressively and adopt tough on crime approaches to criminal justice, you're just going to put a lot of people in prison, even though the conditions they're living in aren't their fault. And I think the idea that a generous social welfare state can be a crime prevention strategy is something that we are trying to reintroduce. And things like Clean Slate, things like ending debt-based driver's license suspensions, going after fines and fees, removing other barriers to employment, et cetera, are based on the idea that if we remove economic barriers to success for people, we're actually going to help people succeed and prevent crime going forward. And I think that is a philosophy that's much more in line with what the evidence says, with what we as people who care about other people should be supporting. And I think that's where we want policy to go. Unfortunately, since 2020, there's been some real backsliding in a lot of these attitudes politically. There was stuff that happened during the pandemic that was really unhelpful. And I don't need to go into it, but there's media components, there's social media components to it, and there's just sort of national political stuff around sort of like what makes people safe and what causes crime that I think has misled the Republican Party in particular. But we have lost a bipartisan consensus that we had for about 10 years that we should really be doing prevention and we should be trying to reduce the footprint of the justice system and help people get out from under criminal records and past involvement. The basis for many of the reforms we worked on, from Clean Slate to presumptive parole, was cooperation with Republicans and Democrats. And we really don't have a lot of that now, except with respect to some of the work to help people get jobs, and help remove barriers to employment. Even barrier to housing work has really become polarized in ways that make it difficult to pass. So that's kind of where we are. But as Matt said, we are 37% below the prison population peak in 2006. That's good. It's the lowest level since 1989. If the if the year were to end today. So it's positive, but I think we're in a period of backsliding, and you know, I hope that we can get things moving forward again soon.
Thank you, John. And I'll just briefly say I'm glad you mentioned jails. We haven't focused on that in this symposium, and you can look at the data and see the prison population going down. There's a whole terrible situation in jails around the state where people kind of churn in and out. Okay, next we're going to go back to Deb. John works largely with the legislature. He's going to be doing a workshop at the end of the day about how to talk to your lobbyists. Deborah LaBelle works through the courts, and over to you, Deborah.
Okay, thanks. So some of the progressive stuff that's happened is, you know, there was a whole group of us nationally, lawyers who sat down and decided to address the incarceration, extreme incarceration and sentencing of youth. We started actually almost 15 years ago and decided to target life without parole at the time when some of us were getting rid of the death penalty for youth, and we had a whole strategy, you know, that we would go after, you know, the death penalty. That was 70 kids. Then we go after a documentation and a litigation against life without parole for youth, which was thousands of people, and many of you know Michigan was the second highest in the country. In the world, because of two things. One, the harsh laws that made 14 automatic adultification from 14 on up for what we call the dirty dozen, 12 different crimes, including homicide and armed robbery and a number of others. So there was no more waiver. If you were 14 and up then, you got automatically tried as an adult for these offenses. So that increased the population, and for life without parole, it made us the second in the country. Plus we have felony murder, which many states do not, most states do not, which is, you know, you're in the car, there's a felony being committed that you're aware of and you're participating in, you're gonna help drive people to do a drug deal and someone dies, you get the same offense as the person who committed the homicide. So those two things combined to create the high levels in Michigan, not just of life without parole, but also extreme sentencing. Again, 40% right now almost of the youth in prison are serving sentences above a 20-year minimum, for children, okay? So, you know, getting at the extreme sentencing that we said, we'll first take on what people regard as the worst offense you can do, which is murder. And we'll get the courts to recognize that children are different, that they are children, they have different characteristics, they have less opportunities, the brain science, everything. We would do that and run that up to the Supreme Court, which is what we did. And we got the Supreme Court, all but Scalia at that time, to recognize not juveniles, not convicts, not, you know, offenders, but children, that they were children. And once you recognize they're children, it's very hard to send them to prison for life to die. So that was part of the beginning to then move it all the way down. If you're going to consider them children for homicides, then we're going to have to do it for armed robbery, for, you know, for unarmed robbery, for for everything. We'll bring it down. And, you know, one of the things that happened in the Supreme Court, I do want to say that was a failure, we had briefs from everyone. The court recognized brain science. They recognized the impact on, you know, abuse in the home. They heard from psychologists. They acknowledged, they heard from business briefs. They heard from everyone, and they recognized everything. Faith leaders, victims, everything went into mitigating circumstances except race. They ignored every single amicus brief on race and never spoke about the deep disparity in sentencing of youth, which is race. And so we are now at the point, the Campaign for Fair Sentencing doing nationally, taking away. The majority of states have abandoned life without parole or don't use it, the vast majority now. We are way down. We have the right to resentence youth. Michigan, the courts, because we have focused on the courts and continually focused, bringing Bridget McCormick from the University of Michigan, now Kim Thomas, both of them committed to juvenile justice and criminal legal reform up to the courts, crucial votes when you do it. And we have been able to now include 18-year-olds in the concept of youth. Soon it will be 19 and 20-year-olds. At the same time, the legislature has moved the second chance for youth under the HIDA legislation up to 26, recognizing that kids are different than adults at these younger ages and still impulsive. We have, raised the age, which was spoke about, but we have a ways to go with regard to the extreme sentences of youth and the disparity, the continuing disparity based on race about who gets recognized and who does not as a child. I mean, we know this from all of the literature that, judges look at someone who's a 17-year-old young black man and they don't see a child. They see, and in fact, you'll see it in transcripts throughout. They'll say, this young man, as opposed to, and they see them as older. They don't see them as vulnerable. And these are, the vast majority of judges in our state doing this throughout the state are white. 99% of the prosecutors are white. So, what happens to kids of color is simply, results in a disparity of treatment and punishment. I do want to say that, as we move forward, we really need to have our governors and our AGs committed to this issue. Much as I appreciate Big Gretchen in other areas, she has not been a champion of criminal legal reform. It's not in her bailiwick, it's not what she gets, it's not what she fights for. We have someone running, Jocelyn Benson. I'm going to make a bold pitch here because she, worked at the Southern Poverty Law Project, but she can't do it by herself even if she wins. We need coalitions of people that say, this is our issue. We need you to address it. We need you to make commitments on it. We need it for legislators, and we need it for whoever is going to run for AG. People have to approach them and make them make commitments as to what they're going to do and how they see the world of punishment. And it's a big department. It's a big money cost. And these monies can be transferred to preventative, to education, to various different work. I mean, Matt's doing some great mapping work on where these offenses happen. And if you look at them, they happen around failed schools for youth. So I think that our charge moving forward, even though we're making some progress, is to not backslide. It is to get the people who have some authority over this to make commitments that it's an issue important to them and that they'll work for it. On the litigation front, we're going to be litigating on issues involving youth with extreme sentences and mitigation issues with regard to every youth. For whatever offense you commit, the court should take into consideration your youth and attendant consequences. Also looking at the fact that so many youth are getting longer and harsher sentences than adults, and looking at litigation in that area. So we'll do the litigation. You guys have to do what is, all the polling says people feel that children should not be punished in this way. You need to hold our people accountable to that reality.
Thank you, Deborah. All right, Ronnie, you're up.
I came home from prison, like I said, in 2020, and there was a lot of friends who tried to knew me from in prison and knew me from the work that I was doing in prison and trying to educate people, motivate people, and just get people to get involved with trying to win their freedom. When you have 2 life sentences, that occupies your whole day. Is how can I figure out a way to convince somebody that I'm worthy of a second chance? And like over 20 years ago, a young lady sent me a letter, Deborah LaBelle, and they started inquiring about my juvenile status. I never thought much of it because I never was a juvenile, even though I came to prison when I was 17 years old. They sent me straight to adult facilities. So I never really considered myself to be a juvenile until Deborah LaBelle opened my eyes and said that she was trying to, do something to give us a second chance. Before then, it was really a hopeless situation for most of us. I had spent all my family's money on the pills and whatnot, and feeling really bad about that, and it was just hopeless. So I would like to thank Deborah. I don't think she understands how powerful that Life Without Parole initiative that she started in the state of Michigan was, because it brought so much hope to the people inside. It transformed prisons, where when you don't think that you have an opportunity to go home, then every time someone wrongs you, then you react in a way that you think is appropriate. But when you think that you have a chance to go home, you act in a way that you know is appropriate, and you let things slide. And for the efforts that Deborah and ACLU and how those efforts have brought so much hope to people that had no hope, it's really, she deserves all the accolades that she can get for this, And I just appreciate her, and so many thousands of people appreciate her also. When I came home, I started working with, I see some of my Michigan Liberation people here, gave me an opportunity to work with them and stuff, and it was beautiful, man, I can make a living doing this stuff. But then John Cooper called. Well, he didn't call, I called him. But in the interview process and stuff, he like, I want this guy on my team. And that just did wonders for my self-esteem, to my self-worth. And the things we work on is Safe and Just. We working to bring people home from prison, and I'm proud of that. That's one of the promises that I made to all these transformed souls that I left behind, that I would not forget them, that, I would do whatever I could. I didn't know how powerful, how influential I would be, but to help bring them home from prison. And we do that at Safe and Just, and proud of that. Not going to talk much longer because I want to save time for questions.
You can keep talking if you want. You good?
You don't want me to keep going. Yeah, very proud of the work that we do at Safe and Just. We have a number of different campaigns that we join in with our partners and collaborate on. But one of the things that I'm most proud of, that I'm able to go to lawmakers and speak with them and let them know my story and let them know that I'm nobody special. There's so many people that I left behind who are more qualified to do what I'm doing and would do it better if only they get the opportunity. And once we introduce them to these people, I think of people like Stephen Hibbler and Michael Chappelle, how my man Michael, a couple weeks, last week, he just got resentenced and he'll be coming home soon. So, yeah, and I'm sure you're going to come out here and they're going to be real productive on trying to bring more people or shed light to more of the good people that's left behind. Yeah. All right, I'll end there. But
Thank you, Ronnie. I think we have time. Probably we're going to let Heather synthesize all the questions into probably one mega question. Do you need the microphone, Heather? And looks like we're still setting up lunch, so we'll go a little past noon and give the panelists a chance to have one more round.
Well, we have a couple of questions. Thank you for sending them in. This allows us to record the questions and also keep the accessibility up here, so I appreciate that. I have a few, but I don't think that they will take up the whole time. The first one is for Deborah. It says, I hope to become a civil rights lawyer and work on incredible cases like you do. How do you use the law to make preventative changes instead of being reactive?
I think that's a good question. It's a long question, so I'll try to be a little more succinct. I think that when you see an injustice, you work to think about what a remedy exists. And the injustices come in from getting letters from people saying, this is, deeply wrong. You know, I learned a couple weeks ago from a letter that there's a mandatory lifetime electronic monitoring on youth under the age of 18 for committing certain crimes. I had no idea. So you say, well, that's not right. And you start to bring a coalition of people together that are interested in finding a remedy, both legal. I mean, I do have to say that all of the litigation I do is committed to a human rights model, which is document, advocate, educate, and litigate. So litigation alone won't get you there. You need to put a lot of trust into the people you're working with, like Ronnie and the people inside, to help you understand the issue and what will really get you to some form of justice. And, you know, it's a bit of a reaction to the inequities that are out there, but it's listening and being able to respond and being incredibly creative about, and not let yourself be held back by what's been done in other places.
Thank you, Deborah. So here's a question I think any of us we could hear from any of you. In the case of Brooks Patterson, do you believe that his character was a reflection of the demographic he represented, or that he infected the public viewpoint in his crusades, or both?
And I'll offer some thoughts because I think it's relevant. I think people underestimate the extent to which leadership drives public opinion, and I think the state of our country is a good example of how that works. So I do think he was a toxic force in the state. But you know, I think people all have their own stories, and you know why he was the way he was is probably a very complicated one that I can't speak to.
I just want to add that in 1978, Governor Milliken and most of the elected representatives in both parties opposed Brooks Patterson's campaign to abolish good time credits, because that was a disciplinary mechanism in the prison system. So even people who were tough on crime thought it was a good idea. And by 1986, James Blanchard, the Democratic governor, and most of the elected representatives had taken Brooks Patterson's position. And that's a remarkable political shift in a pretty short amount of time.
And that has persevered, by the way. Our prosecutors, including Dana Nessel, are fanatically committed to truth in sentencing, even though there's lots of good research that says it's bad, both for the prison environment and for crime rates outside of prison. And I'm not gonna say anything more about Dana Nessel, but I don't think anybody on this panel thinks highly of her work in this area.
Yeah, so one more, and I think it's related, but maybe we can get some elaboration. Why do you think across these decades this punitive legislation has stuck so well?
I think it's branding. L. Brooks Patterson was a master brander, you know, and he branded me into a corner that everyone believed. The story that he told, everyone believed. Even, like I said, even I was like, maybe it did, maybe I did. I was guessing myself. So it's branding, and he's always talking about, you know, how out of control or how bad the crime situation was, and that stuck in people's heads, even though they may have more liberal or more caring beliefs. They always came back to as the demographics of Oakland County changed, one thing stayed consistent, that they were going to vote for L. Brooks Patterson. And if you go through Pontiac, you see where the county government buildings and stuff, you see his name on all these things now, because this guy knew how to brand, and most Republicans do. They know how to brand their issues. Democrats do not, and that is something that most of the public can hold on to. Well, I might not support him on this, and he's a little racist on that, but I kind of like that guy, you know? And that was, I would always tell people, L. Brooks Patterson was Trump before there was a Trump, you know? And if you live in Oakland County, you probably tend to agree with me. Okay.
I think Ronnie is spot on, and I'll just add to that by saying, you know, the way crime issues play out in elections is what drives everything. It's all tail wags the dog. I'll give you an example. The rep who brought me to Lansing, he ran for Senate in 22, and he ended up losing that seat in Grand Rapids by 400 votes. Everybody in his district got a mailer from the other side with his face next to Larry Nassar's face. And not because he had said anything about Larry Nassar, but because he had supported some criminal justice reforms. And so one side of things is willing to say anything and blame anything on the other side. It's just a fundamentally dishonest and toxic style of politics that one side is willing to engage in that the other won't. And, it's hard to blame all that on Democrats because they're not playing the same game as the other side. But the reality is Dems don't want to be called soft on crime because voters think this is actually a fair critique when it comes. If you don't know anything more, like seeing this guy's face and Larry Nassar, oh, well, gosh, I don't want to be associated with that guy. He seems like bad news. And there's no real accountability for the things that are being said to voters. And this has been a problem for most of the tough on crime era. There's been conservative guys sending out mailers since the mid-'70s. There's a guy named Richard Viguerie who has pioneered this. And I just think we got to say it is a hard problem because Democrats know they're going to get hit with false accusations and there's nothing they can do about it. And that makes them scared and timid. But also, I do think they are unwilling to make the case that these are things we should do collectively and that they're actually the right thing to do, the smart thing to do. And there was a time when Democrats were willing to stand up and do that, and they're not right now. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to, I'm frustrated because there are many things that could be said, and they need to be out in front of it with talking points and saying it and not, hiding and hoping no one puts an alleged, pedophile picture next to them and, creates this mythology of it. I was watching The Daily Show, and they're saying it's like there's so many pedophiles out there, it's a new constituency. It's like ridiculous. But I think I don't do criminal defense law, even though I'm all in that area now. But, when I would ask someone, I say, well, why is the sentence like 15 to 30 for armed robbery? It's like it doesn't even make any sense. It's not evidence-based. It's not based on, it takes 15 years to rehab anybody. It's like made up numbers. And no one really talks about the fact that these numbers were created based on looking at the average of what judges were doing, guidelines across the state, which none of them had any basis for it either. And then at the same time, judges were doing that average was created was when we had good time. So they took away good time and left the average numbers, and they make no sense. They're not related to what other states do. They're not related to what is done in other countries. And if you came out, as an elected official and say, listen, we're going to hold people accountable, and we're going to do it based on the evidence we have of how long people need to stay in to reform themselves and come back into this. No, they don't talk about that. They just have these mythical numbers, and it actually, as you can see, drives me a bit crazy.
Let's thank the panel for a great kickoff session.